In a few seconds.
I'll share it on Facebook.
And there we go. I think we are live. Yes, we are. Great. How are you feeling?
How am I feeling? I'm great. I'm happy to be here today. Thank you, Ali, for putting this together, and also to all the members and followers of Africa for Palestine for joining us today.
Wonderful. And we are very grateful you accepted our invitation for this exciting webinar series we've been having. To our audience and our viewers, we are Africa for Palestine, a human rights organization based in South Africa. Our mandate and our campaigns are primarily on Palestinian human rights and to push the Israeli influence outside of the African continent. We work with many organizations who identify with our cause, different religious groups, political parties, trade unions, and the broader civil society movement. We have started this webinar series where different people from different walks of life come onto the webinar series and give us their stories, their realities about the Palestinian issue and their line of work. We've had many people from the academia, from the entertainment industry, the arts, Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists alike. I do not want to discriminate, but we've had everyone on this webinar series to give us their side of the story. Today we have activist and journalist Anya Parampil, and she will be with us today to talk about Palestine, Venezuela, and the media. Anya, thanks again for joining us, and thank you again for accepting this invitation. For our audience who are not familiar with you or your work, just tell us about yourself, tell us about your background and the kind of activism you're involved in.
Well, again, it's my honor to be here and to speak with all of you today. I got my start in journalism actually as an intern on a show many of you might be familiar with called Breaking the Set, hosted by Abby Martin. It aired on RT America. And I got really lucky sending in a resume and was called in to work on her show part-time as an intern. And that eventually evolved into me working full-time as a producer, booking guests, helping write and produce segments. And then when that show ended, which was about a year after I joined, I became a correspondent and eventually anchor at RT America. I stayed there for 5 years, eventually had my own show and had the opportunity to travel the United States and also the world covering news and not just breaking news, but also in-depth documentaries. I had the opportunity with RT to actually travel to Palestine, and that I was there for 2 weeks in the beginning of 2018. And so as someone who, since I was very young, I was very clear on where I stood on the Palestinian cause, thanks to books, honestly, such as Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, written by our former president in the United States, Jimmy Carter. I thought when he used that word, it made things pretty clear to me. And because I wasn't conditioned one way or another to take a side from a young age on Palestine, the choice was natural for me just as a person, as an individual, to stand with the Palestinian people who I saw as the oppressed in this scenario. So I already was very aware of the situation and passionate and clear in my position, but going and seeing Palestine and the occupation firsthand really strengthened my resolve in wanting to work to expose Israel and its crimes and also stand with the Palestinian people. It strengthened my love for the Palestinian people. And I can talk more about this later, but I also had the opportunity to go to Gaza during that time, which was a really special trip because now it is very difficult for journalists, foreign journalists, to enter the territory. So I'm very grateful that I got that experience. And
Um,
since I should say, I should add, since the end of 2018, I've no longer been with RT. I'm working with the Gray Zone with my colleagues Ben Norton, Aaron Mate, and my husband Max Blumenthal. And we since then I've had the chance to really get very deep in the Venezuelan issue, because right as I was wrapping at RT, that's when the United States initiated its latest coup attempt, recognizing Juan Guaido, this unknown opposition figure, as president of the country. And throughout my years at RT, I was never allowed to visit Venezuela, even though I had the opportunity, for example, to witness the presidential elections in 2018. And this is part of the sanctions program, actually, which the United States has implemented on Venezuela. People say that the harsh sanctions only began under the Trump administration, but it's really not true. What happened in 2015 when the Obama administration declared Venezuela to be a national security threat to the United States, although I can't think of any evidence or reason that Venezuela should be considered a threat. It's not instigated a war of aggression against any of its neighbors, let alone the United States. This had the effect of making it very dangerous in the eyes of insurance companies to offer insurance to cargo ships, anything major that you want to ship to Venezuela, but also to journalists. It was considered like going to a potential very dangerous war zone due to this national security declaration. And so the insurance was so high that a company such as RT would have to pay for me to go with all of our equipment, that it was just never possible for me to go. And so I jumped on the opportunity. All four of us went in February of last year. I stayed for about a month. I traveled back to the country later in the year and stayed for a month. And so I really had the chance to learn and understand that issue, develop sources here in the United States and also in Venezuela to give me a perspective on the crisis there. And one thing I've had the chance to learn about, which has been so beautiful and exciting for me, is the deep relationship and solidarity and overlap between the Palestine and Venezuela cause. I'm sure we can talk about that later, but also Venezuela and Palestine, the importance of Africa for these two countries, and this emerging world that I think is taking shape that really represents the future of global politics. And a lot of it has to do with Africa and the countries there, the other oppressed countries of the world rising together beyond the era of imperialism and colonialism, and leading the way to a better future.
And you've done a lot of work in occupied areas. You've mentioned, you reported from Venezuela, you reported from Palestine. You've also done some work in Asia and Korea as well. Tell us, how do we structure the narrative to the progressive side? For instance, how do we report that women are being raped in Myanmar? For instance, children are being killed. How do we position the media to the extreme, say, report on those who are oppressed rather than the oppressors themselves?
It's very difficult to have faith in the corporate media. It is by nature owned and controlled by the oppressors. It's controlled by the few corporations, which also happen to control and influence the US government, the largest and most oppressive empire to ever exist in the history of humankind. And so it's no coincidence that the media generally shows the United States in the United States and in Europe. It presents a narrative in a very pro-US line, and we're inundated with images, which would make us think the Palestinians or the Venezuelans are responsible or for some reason deserve their fate. They deserve occupation because they're terrorists, or Venezuela deserves this economic crisis because they're socialists and they've mismanaged their economy. That's the narrative that we're fed in the United States, but it's the narrative because that's what the government, and most importantly, its corporate backers, want us to believe. So I generally don't expect a story of liberation or of struggle to be told in the corporate media. That's why I think it's so wonderful that over the last several years, so many alternative media outlets, organizations such as yourself, which help spread media, they have been fostered by this era of social media, Facebook and Twitter, Instagram. These are great tools, even though they present a whole new challenge, which is the fact they're also corporate and they're changing. Twitter is now labeling certain media outlets as state owned. Of course, it's not universal. It mainly targets Russian and Chinese media outlets. I've yet to see a BBC reporter or network or a Voice of America network labeled with this stamp. However, they're already trying to make people question foreign media. And this is important because while state media isn't the same thing as alternative or independent media, in many cases, they have in the past been great allies to alternative media. And just if you look at the case of Russia and China, those are two countries which have the power to really challenge the US hegemony on the global stage. And so their media outlets, I believe, are very important in countering the US media narrative and covering conflicts which involve both of those countries, but also Venezuela, also Palestine, also Africa in a different way. And so it's significant that now we're seeing a change on some of these social media sites, which makes it more difficult. I believe it will have the impact. They're starting with the Russians and Chinese, but who knows where this will lead. If it's okay for them to, if they get away with that and there's no outrage over that label, then they'll slowly start to introduce more labels. Perhaps they'll introduce a label targeting the gray zone or Africa for Palestine. I know Electronic Intifada, a great resource on Palestine, a great outlet based in the United States and actually has reporters all over the world covering the Palestine issue on a daily basis, has had a lot of trouble on Facebook, for example. So we have to be aware that while these social media sites are great tools, we need to be ready to come together and defend each other as these labels come out, or if we notice that their algorithm changed and we're not getting the same news that we once had. I think eventually I would hope that alternatives to these outlets can rise, but I worry that it's very expensive, very difficult to get people to join alternative sites. In the United States, I think we have to agitate for these websites to be publicly owned and traded as opposed to corporate, because the way it stands right now, our Constitution doesn't apply. If they want to remove you from Twitter, Twitter has the right to do that because it's Twitter. They're a private corporation. You can't necessarily make the case that our rights as individuals, as applied in the U.S. Constitution, would apply to that situation. And so I think that's something that we have to do, and that would make perhaps the sites more equitable for everyone. I also think that would have to come as part of a wider structural change in the United States. I don't have any rosy glasses on thinking that it will be something very easy to get, because of course Facebook, Twitter, they really fear that more than anything. That's why they're so willing to comply with the security state and roll out these labels and make their sites less equitable, because they're ultimately afraid of being taken over by the government at all. And I guess that's where I'll leave it on the question of the media, focusing it on social media, because I think corporate networks are a lost cause. I've had the chance in the last several years actually to go on a very popular US news program called Tucker Carlson Tonight. It's the most watched news show in the United States. It's a show that is watched by President Trump himself. And while there is plenty on the show I disagree with, they have invited me on to discuss Venezuela, to discuss issues of war, my reporting in Honduras. And so if given that opportunity, I take it. Max, my husband, in the past has actually spoken on that show about Israel, about the fact that when the United States was forcing RT America to register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, he went on Tucker Carlson to point out the fact that AIPAC, the American Israel Affairs Committee, is not registered as a foreign lobbying agent, but now the United States is forcing a media company to register under FARA. So we have those breakthroughs. I think that's why I take them when they come, even though I get a lot of criticism sometimes from other people in the progressive or left wing because they say I'm legitimizing Tucker Carlson and his beliefs that I don't agree with. But the way I see it, he's legitimized by the fact he has the most popular show in the country. And I'm going to take advantage of his willingness to have me on to discuss these issues if those issues present themselves. So that's kind of a rare case of an individual who has a platform and actually allows some of us to come on and speak about these issues, but it's not a common occurrence, and it's not. I don't see anyone else in the media really doing that.
You mentioned that you've worked with Eddie Martin, a very renowned activist, as we would like to think, and she has done a lot of outstanding work for Palestine through the Empire Files and others. And she's one of the case in points of those who were targeted in her own industry for her own beliefs and her own activism. We've had many guests on this webinar series from academia who've been targeted for their beliefs, particularly on the Palestinian questions. Those in Hollywood, those in academia. If you can remember, well, there was a professor in the US who refused to write a recommendation for a student going to study in apartheid Israel who was forced to leave the university, Maklamon Hill. How has it been for you, your personal experience? As a person who's outspoken on the issue of Palestine, how's been your experience of the backlash from the pro-Israeli lobby, from the pro-apartheid lobby in the US?
Well, I'm very, very fortunate now to be working with the Gray Zone, which is completely independent, and it's only those 4 people that I listed earlier: Ben Norton, Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, and myself, and we're all kind of on the same page when it comes to Palestine. We might have a few very minor disagreements, but there's no top-down control over what we have to say about Palestine. We also have attracted a base of supporters who come to us because they also agree with us on this issue and all of the other issues that we cover. And so in that sense, I have job security, and I'm very fortunate for that, because it's not typical that a journalist working independently in the United States has that comfort and that freedom that we've been able to secure at the Gray Zone. Other than that, I would also point out that on this issue, on Palestine specifically in the United States, we are winning. I know it sounds crazy when you see President Trump signing the Abraham Accords with leaders of Gulf states and with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. I actually think the presidency of Donald Trump has really helped the Palestine solidarity cause in the United States, in the sense that it's exposed the special relationship that exists between the United States and Israel. You cannot doubt it anymore that the United States and Israel work hand in hand. Trump actually presented Netanyahu with the key to the White House this week, which I thought was a beautiful symbol. He said, "Hey, this is the key to the White House." It was this gesture that really, I think, for many of us who follow the cause, was appropriate, because people understand that the Israeli prime minister wields influence in the White House, has always, for across presidents. I remember there was a comment made by Bill Clinton once after a meeting with Netanyahu: who's president anyway, me or him? Because they'd had such a heated argument. I forget exactly what the issue was, but it was very frustrating for Clinton that he felt like he was subservient in some ways to the Israeli prime minister. And I'm have a more complex view of this issue. I think Israel serves a very specific purpose for the United States. Israel wouldn't exist without all of the billions of dollars of military support provided by the United States. And so it's not just only that Israel dictates the United States. It's like a two-way street. Israel serves a very specific colonial purpose in the Middle East historically. It's like a representation of European and now US power in the Middle East after World War II. But because Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, because he speaks so openly about the relationship between Israel, his son-in-law Jared Kushner is someone who Netanyahu, when he would travel to the United States, would literally sleep in Jared Kushner's bed when he was a child, and his parents would host Netanyahu. Jared would go sleep somewhere else, but it's been reported in media that his family was so close to Netanyahu that Netanyahu would actually stay in the Kushner household. This is someone who's now really close to the president, running Middle East policy. He's the one putting together the so-called deal of the century. And so the effect of that has been even the liberal corporate media has come around on Palestine in a way that I never thought was possible. And I think the clearest example of that is the fact that someone who's always been considered kind of a liberal Zionist in the Palestine Solidarity Circle, a journalist named Peter Beinart, who's a columnist for the New York Times, actually recently published an article in the New York Times essentially saying that only if we're going to be concerned with human rights and having a real equal state, the only possible way forward is one state, a Palestinian and Israeli state, that where people have equal rights, and otherwise we're veering down a really dangerous path. This is a perspective that figures such as Ali Abu Nima, my friend and a friend of the Gray Zones, he's the editor and founder of Electronic Intifada. He was writing the book One State years ago. I believe it was published in 2006, 2007. And I don't think any of us who for a long time have believed that the only just solution to Palestine is a one state solution, where it's not based in the Jewish identity, but based in equal rights for Palestinian and Jewish and all citizens in the territory from the river to the sea. I don't think we ever believed or could have imagined that the New York Times would be coming out with an op-ed making the case for one state. But that is the impact of having this very extreme close relationship with Israel, which we've witnessed under the Trump administration, and also the fact that Netanyahu himself is seen as a very unsavory character, especially to progressive Jews in the United States who may support Israel, but think that Netanyahu himself represents this right-wing, what they always use the term authoritarian wing of global leadership. He gets lumped in with figures such as Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil or Viktor Orban in Hungary. And when I was in Palestine, I had the opportunity to cover the massive demonstrations in Israel led by Israelis against Netanyahu due to his corruption cases, which he's been indicted in. And he's been prime minister for so long at this point. He kind of, even in spite of these massive corruption scandals, that he kind of doesn't look like a very democratic figure anymore. And I think that's also helped the image or damage the image in the eyes of progressive liberal Jews in the United States, and helped reveal Israel for what it is. Because what does it say about Israel if this is the person, this is the only figure that they can come up with to lead that country? There's a reason why he hasn't been removed from office, and it's because there really isn't someone else that they see within the Israeli establishment as capable of keeping the country together.
Interesting that you mentioned that liberal Zionist, which for me is a really strange concept. The liberal Zionists, that they're writing about how they should be own state. We were following the Harrods articles and other publications when the nation state law was passed. And the overwhelming feeling was that Israelis can no longer ignore it anymore. This is an
Yep.
apartheid state,
The
and they
nation
will have
state
to
law was
accept
very
that this
important.
is an apartheid. So when you mentioned that Trump and Netanyahu are helping the Palestinian cause, absolutely I agree. This right-wing offensive on Palestinian and other progressive shows to those who are on the fence and to those who are liberal, it shows them that this is a proper apartheid state. Let's move to Venezuela. You've covered a lot on Venezuela. You've done a lot of work, and like you said, you spent a month there. For our audience and our viewers, just take us down, or just shortly, what is happening in Venezuela? What has caused it to happen? And what do you see the future looking like for Venezuela? And I'm saying this because we say this in Africa to many of our Venezuela comrades, that it's difficult to get news out of Venezuela. It's very hard to get tangible news. If it's not the Gray Zone, if it's not Min Press and other progressive publications, which are very few, by the way, you get a lot of fake news, a lot of mistruths on the internet, on mainstream media, and so on. So for our audience and viewers, just take us to what has happened, what is happening, and what do you think the future holds for Venezuela?
People are probably very familiar with the name Juan Guaido, and that's because this latest round of US aggression against Venezuela, from the outside, from where we can see it, began in January of last year, when Juan Guaido, this previously unknown opposition figure, whom, according to even opposition pollsters in Venezuela, was only a recognizable name, over 80% of the population had no idea who he was. I'll say that in reverse. And he stood in the middle of the square and said that he was taking on his constitutional duty to serve as president of Venezuela. The United States recognized him immediately, and so did its European allies. I should mention, it took about a week for Europe to follow the suit of the United States. Europe said it was going to wait and see, but then the United States ran these pressure campaigns in European capitals across the continent to pressure, and who knows, the Venezuelans say that there were blackmail and all of these tools the US empire uses involved in order to force Europe to recognize Guaido. And Guaido was basing his claim to the presidency on the fact that he was serving as the president of Venezuela's National Assembly, which is the legislative branch in Venezuela. It's currently declared in contempt. It's a defunct branch of government due to a Supreme Court ruling. This is over questions regarding the last parliamentary elections and the elections which came out of Amazonas state, where there were allegations of election fraud. I'll note that not only were 3 opposition figures implicated in that fraud, a Chavista candidate also entered the National Assembly as a result of the fraud claims in Amazonas. The Chavista candidate accepted the ruling of the Electoral Commission, said that they would go along with an investigation and a re-vote count, but the opposition candidates did not. And so since that point, the National Assembly has been declared defunct essentially by the Supreme Court. So it's important to know that when we hear about Juan Guaido's claim to the presidency. There's a whole another path we could go down discussing the various constitutional situations or situations spelled out in the Venezuelan constitution, which would lead to the National Assembly president taking over. And none of those instances were present in the case of Venezuela. This was just a trick the Venezuelan opposition used to give the United States and its allies the excuse, or the ability, I should say, to recognize the opposition as the government of Venezuela. And the more that I've learned about the Venezuelan opposition, particularly the figures based in the United States, the more I truly believe that these individuals, the ones that we don't hear about, Juan Guaido is actually a no one, a nobody. Even in the Venezuelan domestic context, he is not considered the leader of the Venezuelan opposition. He's considered the face they've put out there in front of Leopoldo Lopez, who's really the individual pulling all the strings. This is the founder of Guaido's party, Popular Will. He's also the founder of the Primera Justicia party. Both parties have deep ties to the United States, or received support in some way or another from the United States. And he is really the person that is seen as the leader of the US-backed opposition in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez. He just happens to be under house arrest because in 2015, he helped lead these very dangerous and violent protests in the street known as guarimbas. And at one point during these demonstrations, Leopoldo Lopez actually urged people in the street to go burn down government buildings and commit acts of terror against the state. And a crowd did eventually go right after his speech and try to set the Attorney General's office on fire. So he was implicated in that. For that, he's under house arrest. He's not able to participate in electoral politics. So what happened at that time is a close ally of Leopoldo Lopez, Carlos Vecchio. This is a name that you don't hear as much when you hear about the coup in Venezuela, but he's someone that everyone who is studying the case of Venezuela should be aware of, because he currently serves as Guaido's ambassador to the United States. He is a very key figure because he was close to Lopez. He was involved, also charged in that same act of terror in the streets, of encouraging violence against the state, but he fled the country at that point and ended up in the United States. And since then, this is something that I learned in working on a profile of him with a Venezuelan colleague of mine, Diego Sequeira, who works for the Venezuelan publication Misión Verdad, which I encourage any Spanish speakers to follow. They also have an English section, but they're a great resource on Venezuela. And we took a look at Vecchio's autobiography, and he actually wrote about how since he came to the United States in 2015, he'd essentially been running a lobbying campaign of the US government. He built this right-wing base of support in Miami with the Venezuelan exiled community, very similar to what used to be the Cuban exiled community. And they're very influential because, as we know, Florida is a very important state in the US electoral context. It's a state anyone who wants to win the presidency sees as a must win because of the amount of delegates that come with winning Florida. And they have influence among Democrats and Republicans alike. There were articles that I found explaining that Vecchio was kind of leading a little lobbying mission out of Miami, meeting with politicians from the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, senators such as Marco Rubio, figures such as Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And he was talked about as someone who was known all around Washington, especially in the Florida context. And so he successfully is the one who lobbied for the National Security Declaration under Obama and the initial wave of sanctions. And then under Trump, he and his team are really the ones who, I believe, crafted this strategy of declaring Juan Guaido president. And Juan Guaido is really, for them, just a useful idiot. the more I've learned about Venezuela, the more I believe that these figures, Vecchio and his cohorts, they may have convinced people in the United States who have no idea about Venezuela that if they declared Guaido president one day, that things would just change overnight. But anyone with the knowledge of the country knows Maduro and the government as a project since the time of Chavez is very deeply embedded in the military. It has the police on its side. There wasn't going to be a quick switch, because those are really the things that you need if you're going to carry out a coup or overthrow a country. As we saw in Bolivia, if the revolutionary government does not have ties, deep ties to the military, everything can be undone overnight. But in Venezuela, that's not the case. And so anyone looking at the situation could have told you nothing is going to change as a result of this declaration. Some crazy guy declared himself president in the street. He was stupid enough to think that it would work out. But they did get something very important from this declaration, from this recognition of Juan Guaido, that I think has been overlooked in the media and even in alternative media when looking at this coup. And that's the fact that really the gain that they made with this declaration of Juan Guaido is the fact that all of his figures in the United States and Europe now have control over millions of dollars worth of Venezuela's assets. And something I've covered very closely and investigated at the Gray Zone is the case of Citgo Petroleum, which is Venezuela's largest, most expensive, highest valued asset in the international, in the world. It is a gas station in the United States, but it's also a refinery. And it used to get shipments directly from Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, and distribute it around the country here. But as a result, not necessarily of US sanctions, but the sanctions play a big part in it. But it's gotten even deeper than that, and I don't have time to go into it now. You can read my investigations at the Gray Zone. But essentially, as a result of the coup declaration, the Venezuelan oppositionists working in the United States, Carlos Vecchio and a man named Jose Ignacio Hernandez, who served as Guaido's attorney general, he was able to really manipulate US courts and make it so that we could be on the brink of Citgo's liquidation. Citgo may soon be sold off completely in order to pay back companies which the Guaido officials actually worked for. This is a company called Crystalex. It's a Canadian mining firm. And before he was working as Guaido's attorney general, this individual, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, was actually had worked as a legal advisor and a paid witness in court on behalf of this company that was suing the Venezuelan state. So then he switched sides and crafted a legal strategy as a result of this coup, which directly helped that company. Carlos Vecchio himself, before he was a politician, was an attorney for ExxonMobil, one of the largest oil corporations in the world, which was kicked out of Venezuela in 2007, but would like to return under a government friendly to the United States. And so that's the company really he represents, which will also benefit from the liquidation of Citgo. It's on the short list to buy Citgo, partially as a result of these moves. So these figures, they represent corporations, they represent foreign entities, they don't represent the Venezuelan people, but they've, as a result of this coup, successfully run an operation of theft, stealing millions of dollars worth of Venezuela's assets. And I think they knew that they were never going to return to Venezuela. They were never going to become important politicians or lead a charge in Venezuela. Again, they're essentially going to be in the United States for the rest of their lives. And so they might as well make a ton of money, and they might as well form this very powerful right-wing lobby in the United States, which they can lead and be influential in Washington. They're wined and dined by Mike Pence and by Ivanka Trump. And Guaido is just this useful idiot that they put up there to give themselves cover for this theft. They didn't change the situation on the ground in Venezuela at all. If anything, they've actually strengthened the position of the Venezuelan government, because people who may have had complaints about the government before this coup now see that it is a direct target of the United States. And also the Venezuelan opposition is in complete and utter free fall, fractured as a result of this coup attempt. One of the main remaining opposition figures in the country, Enrique Capriles, recently said that Guaido's strategy of boycotting elections has failed. And there are people in the opposition who are really recognizing, the ones who actually live in the country, the impact of sanctions. And they look on the people on the outside who are lobbying for this. And it's just not a very good look if you're from Venezuela and you're actually lobbying for the starvation of your own people. And so the opposition is fractured over this. Some of the members of the opposition actually want to participate in the upcoming December parliamentary elections, even though Guaido has called for a boycott. Juan Guaido will most likely lose his seat in the National Assembly in December because he's boycotting the election entirely, although he probably would have lost it anyway because of all of the damage he's done to his reputation. So when that happens in December, the United States will undoubtedly roll out a new narrative claiming that Guaido was prevented from running or that he was unjustly kicked out of office. But again, his illegal claim to the presidency was based in the fact that he was serving in Venezuela's National Assembly. So it will be interesting to see what he tries after December. And regardless of what happens on the ground in Venezuela, where again, I think Chavismo, I think the government is stronger than it was before they recognized Juan Guaido. The important thing to remember is that the people who really crafted this coup in Washington won a lot. They got a ton of money. They've got a lot of influence and power, and that will continue regardless of what happens on the ground in Venezuela.
So tell us, what do you see as the future of Venezuela? Sorry, we know in South Africa we tell them, our counterparts, that we believe, by the way, that it's too much democracy in Venezuela. There's votes almost every year for every institution. You know, for a dictatorship, Venezuela really has a lot of democracy. So as we go to the December elections, also, what type of future do you see for Venezuela given the sanctions of the U.S. and the ongoing imperial pressure?
Well, this is a key question because while the government has survived what I think many people who maybe didn't know as much about the country would find surprising, the fact that they've survived this recognition of Juan Guaido by the United States, really continued pressure and aggression. We saw the power outages in Venezuela last year, which it, as well as Russian investigators, declared to be the result of outside attacks. The main dam in Venezuela, which provides electricity to the country, suffered an outage just hours after Senator Marco Rubio from Florida made a declaration on the Senate floor that Venezuela was in store for some of the harshest and most difficult period of its existence. So that was a very odd timing that the electricity in the country went out just moments after he made those statements. But the United States has waged an unbelievable campaign of oppression on Venezuela. Economic terrorism is actually what the Iranian foreign minister describes it as. And I love telling this story because last year I was in Venezuela for the meeting of the non-aligned movement, which in Africa you probably hear of much more than we do in the United States. But
we owe a lot of our freedom from the non-aligned movement. We know that history very well.
It was a beautiful meeting. It was held in Venezuela. Again, these are 120 UN member states. It's the largest UN member state bloc. Basically, everyone other than the United States and Europe is in the room, and then some of their client states in Latin America. But there was a meeting of, it was the meeting of the foreign ministers, and they were each giving interventions, some diplomats, some foreign ministers, about the question of sanctions. And Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, he held up his cell phone in the room with all of these diplomats and said, Google terrorism on your phone right now and read the definition and tell me that that is not what they are doing to our countries as a result or through US sanctions. He said, we shouldn't say sanctions because sanctions implied we're being punished for something. This is nothing but financial terrorism. And the other countries in the room included Russia and China, who, although those countries weren't a part of the original non-aligned movement, now are observing members, and the deputy foreign minister of Russia was present. Zimbabwe, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Turkey, Nicaragua, Cuba, so many nations in the room that represent actually the global majority. Were there to speak out in opposition to US sanction, to US terror economic policy. And I say that because, as I mentioned, and actually the Palestinians have a delegation also that they send through the Palestinian Authority. The foreign minister of Palestine was present for this meeting. He gave an intervention on sanctions. And based on my own experience as someone who's actually gone to Gaza, I can say that's the model that they would love to export to the rest of the world when it comes to a blockade, when it comes to the medieval style siege, the starvation, the suffering that Israel has inflicted on the Gaza Strip, whether it's through the land or the sea. That is the original sanction siege. That's what the United States is trying to do to Zimbabwe. That's what the United States is trying to do to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Venezuela, to Iran. And so I say this because in recent days, and especially in recent months, we've seen a very important development in Venezuela, which is the breaking of this blockade by the Iranians. Just this week, the Iranians sent some necessary mix that is used to dilute Venezuelan crude. It's called condensate. This was after 5 ships earlier this year delivered crude to Venezuela, crude that it used to receive from the United States. But as a result of sanctions, it no longer receives. Of course, Venezuela is the number one producer of, or has the largest oil reserves, I should say. It's not the largest producer, but it has the largest oil reserves in the world. So people might be saying, well, then why does it need crude from the outside? It's because Venezuela mainly produces heavy crude, which means it needs lighter crude and certain chemicals to mix it and actually make it usable. And it used to receive these products from the United States. Sanctions made that impossible. And so I find the Iranian shipments of light crude and other resources needed for Venezuela's oil industry to be such a beautiful symbol of the changing world that I think we'll see get stronger and is rising over the next several years. The United States would love, and in fact, it's trying to keep Venezuela under a medieval style siege. It sent a warship into its waters as a very clear signal that it was considering a naval blockade, an outright naval blockade on Venezuela, similar to what the Israelis do to Gaza. But the Iranians broke it, showed that the United States is it really going to risk all-out war with Iran, potentially Russia, and Venezuela in order to get its way? I don't think so, at least not yet. And so the Iranians were able to send these ships. Remember, this is an administration, the Trump administration, which uses this old Monroeist language and calls Venezuela its own backyard. It calls Latin America its own backyard. And yet Iran, from the other side of the world, has been able to break this terroristic medieval blockade, bring much needed resources to the Venezuelan people. And that's just one example. Turkey is another important ally of Venezuela's. Venezuela had a visit from the Turkish foreign minister just a few weeks ago to underscore some of the important trade between the two countries. People might be aware of the clap boxes, the resources of the boxes of supplies and food that the Venezuelan government provides 6 million households on a monthly basis, twice a month. And some of these products I've seen actually come from Turkey. Turkey's helping supply some of these products that Venezuelans then receive free from the government. Africa is a huge ally as a continent, really, for the Venezuelan people. I should say when I was talking about the non-aligned movement, that includes so many African nations. And last year, when the United States actually wanted to remove Venezuela's legitimate government from the United Nations General Assembly during the UNGA last fall, actually exactly a year ago this week, I did a story about how Venezuela defeated this attempt by the United States. And really, it had to do with Africa, because the African countries are the largest bloc, and they are firmly in the camp, aside from a few exceptions, of Venezuela. Venezuela has prioritized relations with Africa ever since the revolution in 98. I interviewed the vice minister for Africa, a man named Yuri Pimentel, and he told me that when Chavez entered office, Venezuela only had diplomatic relations with 20 African nations. And today, that number is 54. And it's 54 because Venezuela also recognizes the Western Sahara. And I think that just really represents this beautiful world that I think is the future. And it's not going to let US policy dictate suffering on the peoples of the world. Iran stepped up to the plate. I think Russia and China will continue to step up to the plate. And that doesn't mean the impact of sanctions in the immediate future are not going to be very difficult, not only in Venezuela, but around the world. But I like to just bring a more positive message and say that I do think the world is changing, and that we'll see a new world within a few years where the United States can't continue these terroristic financial policies in the way that it has.
We are running out of time, so let's go to the last point here, and to our audience. Anya has spent time in Palestine, like you said before. You've reported from Palestine, and we know, before you tell us about your experience there, that the only democracy in the Middle East is very, very hostile to journalists. We know they closed the Al Jazeera office some years back. They've been killing, literally through their snipers, Palestinian members of the press. So tell us about your experience in Palestine, your experience being there physically as a journalist, and tell us again, the last part, how do you see Palestinian reporting, in your view, in mainstream media in US and abroad? And how is it? Is it fair? Is it biased? Is it unbiased? How is the reporting in Palestine in your view?
I'll start with the second part of your question, which I'll keep it brief, because as I said, I do think, although we don't get fair reporting generally about Palestine, even though it's very biased in US corporate media, we are winning. And there's a hatred of President Trump in the US media, and that helps because Israel is now associated with Trump. Especially, as I said, you have the Abraham Accords, this very absurd development where a bunch of client states that really are just created by the West get together and sign a peace agreement. Yay, what a victory. But in the media, with time, I think, especially as this younger generation, my generation and people who come after me rise and become more powerful in the media, I think there will be a change in the coverage of Palestine, because there's no sham peace process that we've grown up with witnessing or believing in. There's only been the routine bombing of Gaza and a really ugly occupation. And even among young progressive Jews, Israel is a lost cause in that sense. So these are the people, this younger generation, whether Jewish or not, they don't see Israel in the same way that older generations did. And so I think coverage will change. Power structures may not in the United States, so that will make it very difficult, because Israel is an outpost of US empire. And as we've already discussed, corporate media is only going to toe, in generally, an imperialist line. So that won't change. But when it comes to the average person, I think we win. We definitely win on the Palestine cause. And as for the first part of your question, what it was like for me, I'll share two stories that I think are important in understanding my experience, but also just Israel in general. And that is, at least in the US context, a lot of times Palestine gets separated from the region. There was a lot of debate in the United States among the Palestine solidarity circles about where to stand on the war in Syria, for example. And it really did a lot of damage to Palestine solidarity organizing because it became this firebomb. I mean, groups split up over the question of Syria, some saying that Assad was an evil dictator who needed to be removed, others people saying, well, Syria, if you're on the side of Palestinians, you need to side with the Syrians, who are a direct target of Israeli crimes. Israel is directly participating in this regime change war, and Syria is a very important force in the history of Palestine solidarity. So that was very difficult for me to witness in the United States. I took the side of, you have to be against regime change wars, period. And also Syria is a very important country in the context of Palestine. And just in general, I mean, I didn't want to see this beautiful country with thousands of years of civilization destroyed by the US and its allies. So when I was in Palestine, it was so interesting because one morning I woke up and Max was already up watching the news. And for the first time in decades, an Arab state had shot down an Israeli jet. And it was because an Israeli jet had violated Syrian airspace. And for reasons that are kind of complicated, for the first time ever, because Israel had been doing this hundreds of bombing campaigns every year, really, in the Syrian war, at least dozens. So Israel has bombed Syria thousands of times since the start of that war. But this time, Syria actually shot down an Israeli jet, and it crashed, landed in Israeli territory. So it was so interesting to be in the region at that time, because it was all the media and people around were just in shock that for the first time, Israel's gone around and it's bombed Gaza so many times. It's been bombing Syria all these years, but for the first time in decades, someone hit back and hit an Israeli plane. And it showed me why you can't remove Palestine and Israel from the context of the region. I wanted to tell that story because, as I said, in the US context, this became a tricky question. But I think that showed very clearly that sides and where they fall. Israel is in direct conflict with the strong, independent Arab states in the region. It's not a big victory for Israel to sign peace agreements with a bunch of monarchies, but these actual states that represent a history and represent civilizations such as Syria are very staunchly opposed to Israel. And so that goes into the second part of my story, which was that day, Max and I had to go get our press passes so that we were actually allowed to go to Gaza. Israel, of course, controls who can enter and who cannot enter Gaza. So we needed a special accreditation from the Israeli press office. And as I said earlier, at that time, I was working for RT, which helped me in this scenario because while I didn't see myself as a representative of the Israeli government, the Russian government. In the eyes of the Israeli press office, they saw RT, they saw Russia, and Russia has very good relations with Israel. And so they kind of had to approve my press credential. They couldn't make up an excuse or say that I was from some fake outlet. They recognize RT, they work with RT, they work with Russia. So that's why they approved us. But they also viewed us as representatives of the Israeli government. We actually sat down in this guy's the head of the press office. And he had our two passes there printed out, like behind him on the desk, so that we couldn't get them yet. And he sat us down and he said, we're just so disappointed that Russia would let Syria do this, meaning shoot down the plane, because that's really what allowed for it to happen, was the fact that Russia gave Syria the okay to hit back in this case, which is something they'd been trying to avoid throughout the war. And so he lectured us as though we were representatives of the Russian government, saying like, we try so hard to have good relations with Russia, and it's just so disappointing. The Israeli plane wasn't really in Syria, da 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 da. And so we just had to sit there and kind of nod and be like, okay, are you going to give us our press passes now? And then after he lectured us in that way, he did give us the pass and we were allowed to go to Gaza. But I just thought that was a really interesting story because it showed kind of the thinking of the Israelis. It shows the dynamics, the global dynamics at play in the Palestine conflict, Russia, Syria, the fact that you can't remove Palestine from the region. And then ultimately, yes, I was able to go to Gaza and see the blockade firsthand, and see the way that's really the model, again, that the US and its allies, including Israel, would like to export to all of its enemies in the world, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or anywhere else that has an independent, sovereign foreign policy. But I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is that I think those countries will win. The multipolar future is here. It'll come faster than we think. There will be a lot of suffering in the meantime. The sanctions do have a terrible effect, but the world is changing and I'm excited to see it change. I'm excited to see it change in Africa, and I would love to come to Africa one day and also see your movement there and how you guys all fit into this picture.
Yeah, I think when we see what's happening to the progressive world in the global south, the increase of the global right-wing offensive in Bolivia, in Latin America, in Palestine, the signing of the accords, the continued bombings, the arrest of Palestinian activists, the sanctions in Venezuela, the continued occupation of Western Sahara in Morocco. All of these are common in our hope as activists for a better world. And we are evidence of that. South Africa is a living and breathing example of what activism that has hope, that has faith does for an oppressed people. And I absolutely agree with you that in a few years to come, there will be a different world for Venezuelans. There will be a different world for Palestinians as well. Just to wrap it up, Anya, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. What message would you send to young up and coming journalists who are still fighting between activism and reporting? Those who probably like the interns we have students who just graduated who are scared to say Israel is an apartheid state on an established media house, who are scared to disappoint or who are scared to shake the table of the establishment. What message do you have for those young activists in Africa, in Venezuela, in Palestine, in the world?
Don't be afraid. The truth is on your side. That's all your job to do as a journalist, is to tell the truth. So if you're saying Israel is an apartheid state, that's just the truth. And if people don't like it, ultimately they're going to fail. We have the history, we have the masses and numbers on our side. We don't always have the power structure, the ruling class on our side, but we only win that by remaining true to what we know is reality. What is the material reality when it comes to these countries? And I'm glad that you brought up a tension between activism and journalism, because I have no official school training as a journalist. I didn't, in fact, none of my colleagues at the Gray Zone studied journalism. I was studying international affairs in Washington, D.C. I wanted to be a diplomat. I dropped out to work as a reporter, but that was my background. I just studied international affairs. Max studied US history, but all these things kind of give us a perspective that, and a way of thinking that helps us in our journalism. But I bring that up to say you don't need official training. You don't need to go to journalism school to become a journalist. In fact, at least in the United States, in Europe, a lot of the curriculum is based on training you to be objective, which is really a false way of viewing news. If you're objective and you're telling both sides in a way that is not actually telling the truth, then you're doing a disservice to the people you're trying to inform. But I've been accused of people, even people I know in my immediate circle, who went to journalism school, went through that kind of training, of being an activist before I'm a journalist. And I'm not ashamed of that. If people want to lecture me and say that you're a journalist who stands for something, I'm actually quite proud of that. I don't want to just be a robotic journalist who goes through the motions and tells stories. That's what journalists always love to say they do. They tell stories. And I actually want to try and get to the truth of the matter and advocate for something. What is the point of sitting by and documenting history and watching history if you're not going to say, this is how people's lives could improve? So don't be ashamed of being an activist. I think being an activist and being a journalist go hand in hand. Definitely you have to be professional and fair in your reporting, in the sense that you have to be thorough. You can't cut corners. You have to really do the work to make sure that you have sources on that. If you're going to take a line, that you have the information to back it up. But you shouldn't be afraid, and you shouldn't be discouraged from trying to become a journalist, because the way I see it, the empire, the elite, they believe that they say that they're in an information war. And so if that's the case, we need more soldiers on our side. That's something that I always like to say to young people. It doesn't take a lot other than passion and kind of an understanding for the way the world works to be a journalist and to make an impact. So I encourage anyone who's interested in doing that and going for it.
Anya, thanks again for agreeing to be on this platform. Anya is on Twitter at Anya Parampil. You can ask questions. This video will remain in the video section of our page, Africa for Palestine. So you can send your questions, then we'll communicate them to Anya. She responds in kind. She's not hostile to those who ask questions. You can also check out Grey Zone. There's a range of news, authentic, progressive news, alternative news from the mainstream media, and you will be informed. Again, thank you for being with us, and it's good night here in South Africa, and it's good afternoon that side, I suppose.
Good night, and thank you so much again, Ali.
Thanks.